In a world where House Targaryen was the ruling family of Westeros, something akin to the Dance of the Dragons was a near inevitability. If endless generations of a bloodline are raised operating under the belief that they are gods among men, and operating with the very real and near godlike power that Dragonfire offers, eventually someone is going to think that they're more worthy of the throne than the person who actually has it. However, the Dance of the Dragons itself was not an inevitability. It was largely the creation of one man, King Viserys Targaryen. A great deal of Viserys' failings can be boiled down to him not saying something and doing it, or not doing something but saying it. But beyond his inability to follow through on his stated goals and his unwillingness to elaborate on his actions, his refusal to fix the problems he created despite the fact that he had an astounding amount of time to resolve these issues essentially guaranteed that his two dueling bloodlines would go to war as soon as he died. It's interesting, because on the surface, especially within the context of the world that he lived in, Viserys Targaryen seems like a halfway decent man, and arguably one of the better Targaryen kings, at least during his reign. But beneath that surface, he was a weak, indecisive, and self-absorbed person whose desire for some kind of lasting importance, but unwillingness to actually work toward that legacy, cemented him as the architect of House Targaryen's downfall. As it stands, like most other major players in the Dance of the Dragons, the accounts detailed in Fire and Blood are lacking in many actual details about Viserys Targaryen. He was described as a kind man who didn't have much of a taste for the tedium of ruling, and he sat on the throne at the height of House Targaryen's power. He hated disagreement and discord, which ironically set the stage for House Targaryen to go from the peak of its strength to its near destruction in a single generation. This thin sketch of Viserys obviously gave House of the Dragon a great deal of room to work with when it came to character development. And it's clear that the person who took form in the series is largely responsible for the mess that came after his demise. The introduction of Aegon's prophecy that the Targaryens were destined to fight the White Walkers puts an interesting spin on the Targaryen dynasty for many reasons. But one of the most relevant aspects of this plot device when it comes to the Dance of the Dragons is that Viserys Targaryen was very decidedly not destined to sit on the Iron Throne. Yes, Viserys ultimately became the keeper of this prophecy, but he only ended up wearing the crown as a result of sexism and dumb luck, which is an incredibly important pillar of the Dance of the Dragons. Viserys eventually had literally catastrophic faith in his, and in turn Rhaenyra's, grand destiny. But that was compounded by the very relevant reality that Viserys was not raised to be king. That certainly isn't an excuse for his many failings, but it is a pretty obvious explanation as to how he could have made such a mess of things so quickly. He was thrust into the position of Jaehaerys' heir, but he was the firstborn son of Jaehaerys' second surviving son, so he did not grow up being trained to be king, and his father didn't either. Ironically, despite the fact that he was chosen for the position, many of Viserys' failings as a king can likely be attributed to the fact that he spent his formative educational years expecting to essentially be nothing and no one of any real impact or importance. It also seems notable and intentional that his lack of interest in ruling was specifically recollected in Fire and Blood. Because yes, he didn't become Jaehaerys' heir until he was a legal adult. But his disinterest seems to at least imply that he didn't do much to prepare himself for kingship in the interim either. Which again, seems to pretty significantly explain how he could have planted the seeds of the Dance of the Dragons without fully grasping that nearly all of the decisions he made regarding his family were the wrong ones. But still, that doesn't excuse his massive failings as a leader and decision maker. Yes, he wasn't groomed for kingship from birth, but the issues between the Blacks and the Greens were evident for decades, and Viserys seemed to believe that the only thing that did matter or would ever matter were his wants and commands. The introduction of his character in House of the Dragon is incredibly telling, because his desperation for a male heir and his willingness to slice open the supposed love of his life in that quest is one hell of a way to start building a character arc. And while his choices going forward may be less outwardly violent, they are similarly guaranteed to get people that Viserys is supposed to love killed. And they are pretty undeniably his choices and his choices alone. He is portrayed as someone who is too easily influenced by the people around him. But many of the biggest decisions that he makes that lay the groundwork for the Dance of the Dragons are paths that are literally solely chosen by him, because he is the only living person who even knows what his intentions are and why he's doing what he's doing. Examining his character through the lens of Aegon's prophecy is pretty relevant, because his decision to kill Aemma for the sake of the son he believes could be the world's savior makes more sense in an incredibly warped way. Similarly, the pivot towards seeing Rhaenyra as his mystically anointed heir, and thus his commitment to keeping her at the front of the line of succession at any cost, is at least more comprehensible from this point of view. However, this is also incredibly dangerous and self-serving in some very obvious ways. The most salient problem here is that Viserys is making life or death decisions based on his individual interpretation of information that may not even be correct. And beyond that, it becomes even more dangerous because no one else knows the driving forces behind these decisions. So from an outsider's point of view, it makes absolutely no sense and is totally unpredictable. Similarly, when the race starts to provide Viserys with his new queen after Aemma's death, arguably the most important information about Viserys' future wife, that she and her children will be essentially taken out of the line of succession, isn't public knowledge beforehand. This is obviously unfair for a multitude of reasons, and would clearly stop many high-ranking families from pushing their daughters forward as potential options for Viserys' new bride. Sure, there could be some silver lining in the possibility that, if everything goes their way, they will at least be related to the royal family. But there is a wide gulf between that possibility and the possibility that their descendants will end up on the Iron Throne. But beyond the fact that Viserys' choice essentially robbed women of the lone supposed prize that they get as members of a society that treats them as second-class citizens, the dangers of a future civil war if Rhaenyra remained heir are so comically obvious that most powerful lords would and did simply assume that Rhaenyra's inheritance would vanish as soon as Viserys had a son. Clearly, this is unfair, but it's the rules that they are all used to playing by. So it was incredibly irresponsible for Viserys to make the choice to change them without making it fully clear that his intention was for Rhaenyra to inherit after him no matter what, long before Aegon was even born. But even more than that, it was incredibly irresponsible and self-centered for Viserys to have any more children, period, if he wanted Rhaenyra to take the throne. Ultimately, he was not required to marry again. And if he did want to wed after Aemma's death, he could have married someone who was no longer fertile to gain a potential marital alliance without putting Rhaenyra's inheritance at risk. But instead, he married and repeatedly impregnated a teenage girl who was the daughter of House Hightower's second son. So, House Hightower is the family that wound up in the immediate firing line. But ultimately, if Viserys had made the same choices with any other major house in Westeros, it would have resulted in the same crisis. Barring a marriage to a woman who couldn't, or at least didn't, have children, any woman that Viserys married and who had a son would be in the position to either fight for the throne or risk the death of her own children for the sake of cementing Rhaenyra's ascension. But not only does Viserys not give the noble families around him the opportunity to at least choose whether or not they want to position their daughters as potential future queens if that queenship doesn't come along with the traditional inheritance rights for her children. He specifically doesn't give Alicent or Otto the opportunity to choose whether or not they essentially want to sign up for war. Because it's pretty clear that the world is expecting Viserys to change the line of succession if he has a son. And it's obvious that anyone who was angling to wed their daughter to him was doing so because of that assumption. But if Viserys had made it publicly plain that Rhaenyra was going to inherit the throne no matter what, then essentially, it would at least give Alicent the choice regarding whether or not she wants to have multiple children whose lives will be at risk just by virtue of their existence. Because yes, Otto is a social climber who put Alicent in Viserys' line of sight because he was hoping that his grandchildren could sit the Iron Throne. And even when Viserys resisted naming Aegon his heir, he had hopes that a marriage between Rhaenyra and Aegon would solve that problem. So, the likelihood that he would allow Alicent to marry the king and not have children seems low. But if Otto and Alicent were aware that Viserys had no intention of anyone aside from Rhaenyra becoming king or queen, then it would have at least given Alicent the option to avoid pregnancy. Because Alicent did go into her marriage with Viserys knowing that he would literally kill her if he needed to in order to potentially save their baby. But she didn't know that her children would be born into a situation that could also get them killed. By withholding this information, he not only denied Alicent and any one of his other potential brides the opportunity to go into the marriage understanding what the agreement was actually supposed to be, but he also denied Alicent the opportunity to protect herself from the harm or even death that could come with birthing children for Viserys for no reason beyond satisfying his own impulses. And this tells us a lot about Viserys from two different angles. Firstly, it shows a near-complete disregard for Alicent beyond what she can do for him or what he wants from her. Her needs, wants, or even understanding of their relationship is apparently not a concern, to the point where he is willing to risk the life of Alicent and all of her children for his whims. But beyond that, it shows how fatally incompetent he is as a ruler. Sure, he may have managed to keep Westeros on an even keel while he was on the Iron Throne, but to make these moves and foresee no potential blowback down the line demonstrates an astounding lack of understanding of Westerosi politics. Clearly, his desire to bury his head in the sand when it came to the rivalry between the two branches of his family went very far. But to overlook the fact that the Greens and the Blacks were preparing for a potential war for years seems to require more than willful ignorance. I think that Aegon's prophecy certainly plays a part in this. I think that once Viserys came to the conclusion that Rhaenyra must be the heir who was meant to carry that prophecy, her rulership became a foregone conclusion to him. He assumed that she wouldn't encounter any issues ascending to the throne because it was her destiny. But it seems like there has to be more to it than that. Because regardless of his assumptions about what fate awaited Rhaenyra, the writing was on the wall and he did nothing to stop it beyond simply telling everyone what he wanted and assuming that that's what would happen. It seems to indicate a pretty significant lack of political understanding, because he's incapable of seeing what's so clearly coming and he does nothing serious to prevent it. Largely, Viserys' problem seems to be a near-complete inability to see the world beyond himself. And it's more than just a presumption that being king means that he gets to make or remake the rules. His relationships with everyone around him guides his political decisions on an astonishingly grand scale, and the impact of those choices beyond his interpersonal connections seems to be a total non-factor in his mind. Aemma Arryn is portrayed as the love of his life, but his determination to have a son led him to torture her with failed pregnancies for years, and eventually violently murder her for the sake of saving a son who died anyway. And sure, you might argue that this isn't unusual for a king, but his acceptance of and then stubborn attachment to Rhaenyra as his heir seems to show that everything that his beloved wife went through was completely unnecessary anyway. His relationship with Rhaenyra is similarly contradictory, as he is clearly willing to go to any lengths to ensure that he has a male heir for the first half of Rhaenyra's life. But once Aemma dies brutally, he puts Rhaenyra behind him on the line of succession without doing anything to prepare her for the role. Sure, having her play cupbearer is a start, but that's really all it is. He does nothing to build Rhaenyra up as a leader in the eyes of the people around him. And on the contrary, he treats her like a petulant child and is more than willing to punish her when she makes him upset, even if those punishments take her away from court and diminish her ability to actually play a role in Westerosi politics. He spends years allowing Alicent and Otto to run the country when the most obvious and beneficial choice would have been to put Rhaenyra in power long before he was gone. And he spends years letting Rhaenyra and Daemon live isolated on Dragonstone rather than integrating them into the political canvas to ensure a safe transfer of power. Otto's relationship with Viserys seems to be somewhat genuine, but even when Rhaenyra directly states that Otto is intentionally undermining her, Viserys gets rid of Otto because he's upsetting Rhaenyra, and because he's bitter that his teenage daughter might not have genuinely fallen in love with an elderly, decrepit man. It seems like it is much more about Viserys' feelings rather than the political effect Otto could have on Rhaenyra. And, although he didn't have many options for a suitable Hand of the King after the death of Lionel Strong, the fact that Viserys genuinely believes that putting Otto in charge of governing the entire country for years prior to his end won't have a negative effect on Rhaenyra's claim to the throne is absurd. Not only does he expect Otto to risk the life of his daughter and grandchildren in service of Rhaenyra's queenship, but he thinks that somehow his post-mortem wishes will override Otto's frankly completely reasonable concerns about Daemon, both the threat that Daemon poses to his family and the realm at large. In yet another completely self-centric turn of events, Viserys pushes Daemon back in the line of inheritance. Not because he'd be a dangerous ruler, but because he's angry at his brother. He completely disregards the broader concerns about Daemon's leadership, so he once again can't see the obvious war to come because he ultimately forgives Daemon for upsetting him and marrying Rhaenyra. Ergo, the rest of the world's issues with Daemon become irrelevant too. And of course, just as he did with young Rhaenyra, Viserys basically completely overlooks the political education and guidance of his children with Alicent. He seems to have no significant relationship with them whatsoever. And although he has made up his mind that Rhaenyra is the chosen one meant to carry on the Targaryen legacy, teaching his other children how to be effective politicians would be an obvious failsafe in the event that something happens to Rhaenyra. But it's a precaution that doesn't even register on his radar. Hell, while he wasn't the one to set this precedent, it's clear that he doesn't even consider sharing a prophecy that is meant to stop the literal apocalypse with anyone else. Which, should be a pretty serious concern if Viserys were capable of imagining a world outside of the one that he wants to exist. Since Rhaenyra outlived him, he's not entirely to blame. But as we can see in Game of Thrones, by the time the White Walkers become a threat, the only living Targaryen with dragons has no knowledge of this prophecy whatsoever, and needs to be convinced that this is a fight that is worth her time. But still, we're talking about a problem that was world-endingly important. And even then, Viserys did nothing to plan or account for any scenario besides the one he expected to happen. So his short-sightedness was even having a dangerous impact on Westeros centuries after his reign. It's interesting and ironic that Fire and Blood recollects Viserys Targaryen as a kind man and a decent ruler, because deep down, he was neither. On the surface, he may have looked like an adequate Targaryen king, but his choices not only showed a potentially fatal disregard for the people that he purportedly loved, they showed an embarrassingly inept grasp of even the most basic political concepts. Viserys' reputation may have gone relatively unscathed as a result of his mistakes, but his family clearly did not survive his decisions unscathed. Although there are plenty of directions where blame can be thrown for the Dance of the Dragons, Viserys Targaryen was truly the cruel, dim-witted author of the Targaryen Civil War. But what do you think? Could Viserys have stopped the dance with better political maneuvers? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.